Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided the property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his field to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare, but here I am, dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then his son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out the robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Get a fatted calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now the elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your younger brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you. I have never disobeyed your command, and yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes. You killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" The gospel of the Lord. How many of you have ever lost things? And it's usually your mom that finds them, right? Yeah, me too. I remember that. "Mom, where is it?" And the answer was usually, "Where did you leave it last?" Oh yeah, and then you had to go back in your mind and think through the steps. I still do that. I don't lose my shoes and socks so much anymore, but I lose things like my iPad. I misplaced that the other day, and I had to think, now, where would that have gone? As if it would get legs and walk by itself. And I lost a little memory thumb drive. I thought, well, where is that? I retraced my steps, and I thought, it has to be right, and there it was. Sometimes, and maybe as we get older, we're better at retracing our steps, but it's not always easy to remember. It is easy to lose things. We have a lost and found box here at our school. I look at that every once in a while. I wonder, do these kids go home naked? How do we have pants? Or one shoe? What's going on here? Stuff happens, I know. And our parents give us trouble for that. But adults lose things too. Here's an adult example of what a lost and found department is. This is an airline going through its lost and found stuff. Just acres of baggage that has been misplaced or misdirected. If you've ever traveled and had your luggage go somewhere else, don't you sometimes wish you had as interesting a trip as your luggage did? To go to all kinds of interesting places. I've heard of people whose baggages have ended up in Hawaii and they were just going to Phoenix. Now, how does this happen? Lost and found. It's something that we need to think about deeply. I want to think about different perspectives as we look at the parable of the prodigal son today. That's about being lost and found too. And we tend to think of it in terms of ourselves. But I want you to expand your way of thinking a bit. One of the more popular TV shows, at least around my house, although I have to confess I haven't been hooked by it yet, Downton Abbey. How many of you are absolutely addicted to this? A few of you are fessing up, some of you not so much. But one of the things that I have noticed about this show is that a lot of it is from the perspective not of the protagonists, not of the wealthy people, but of the servants. What's going on behind the scenes? How do they perceive what's happening in the big house with the big fancy ways of living? Perspective is important. And perspective can be shaped and changed, manipulated even. So we have to be careful. Sometimes people want us to come to a certain conclusion and they will try to limit our perspective so that we don't see there's a whole range of possibilities that we can choose from. They want us to just have this choice or this choice. Often the choice is huge. There are ways to manipulate perspective in photography. This person isn't really holding the setting sun, is he? But it looks like it. That's kind of cool. These people really aren't pushing up a giant water bottle, but it looks like it. That's cool. This woman isn't really holding up the Tower of Pisa, giving it a big hug. Can make it look like that. This person isn't resting her feet on it either. Kind of can look like that. Perspective is easily shapeable, depending on our environment, depending on where we come from even. A theologian that I read sometimes, Mark Powell, had an interesting thought on this parable. He asked the question of the parable in different contexts, in North America, in Russia, and in Africa. Why did the prodigal son end up where he did? And the answer from people in Russia generally was famine. That's how he got into trouble. The opinion from Africa, nobody helped him. And from North America, he squandered his living. In North America, we tend to have a more puritanical, judgmental way of looking at ourselves and at others. We hold them up to a standard that not even we can attain, and yet we expect other people to. And it becomes a problem. In the parable of the prodigal son, the elder brother is very upset. He probably was relieved that the younger brother finally left because he was tired of him not ever doing anything he was supposed to do and always being a problem and always being the favorite, and finally he got rid of him. And now the kid comes back? Really? And notice in his kind of explanation to the father why he wouldn't come into the party, he squandered his living with prostitutes. He's exaggerating what he did. He's piling on. Our legal system does that to people. They want to make sure people are convicted of crimes even if they aren't really guilty. We do this to one another. We exaggerate the flaws and faults that other people have because we maybe find that way of lifting ourselves up, making ourselves feel better about who we are and what we do. This parable is like a mirror, I think. It shows us ourselves. As we look into it, what do you see? Do you see yourself in the position of the prodigal son who wandered away, who made mistakes, and nobody was there to help me, and so I got into trouble and I had to come back? Is that how you see yourself in that parable? Some of us see ourselves in the position of the elder brother who always did what was right, who never did anything wrong, who never had a problem or an issue, and we complain that other people get something that we didn't have. The message here, the main message here, has nothing to do with either one of those. It is the Father. And that's the perspective I want you to have today. Think about this from the point of view of the Father. And I often, when I preach on this, I call this the parable of the prodigal God. Because the Father in this parable represents God and his attitude toward us. And the word prodigal, we have a negative connotation in our mind to that, but the word prodigal means extravagant, overly generous. And that is what God is to us. Extravagant in his grace. Extravagant in his welcome. Extravagant in his care for us. Even extravagant in allowing us the freedom to make mistakes. Prodigal God. I mentioned that this parable was like a mirror. And when you look in a mirror, do you see the real person there? Or do you see a distortion? Sometimes people look in the mirror and they see what they want to see. And that can be good, and maybe that gives us a direction to move in life. But so often, the lens that we're looking through and the mirrors that we're looking at are distorted. A couple weeks ago, I was in Chicago, and I had to see the bean in Exposition Park. Do you know this sculpture? It's a huge reflective bean. It probably has an actual name. I don't know what it is. I Googled Chicago bean, and that's what everybody calls it, apparently. But it was pretty cool to look at that. I took some video of it, too, when I was there. I haven't finished processing yet. But to see the reflections of people and the skyline, and it's interesting, and it's distorted, and it gives us a different view of what things are. Sometimes mirrors are designed to change our perspective. We all know this note that's on most of our cars, I think. Objects may be closer than they appear, and sometimes they're bigger than they appear and more frightening than they appear, and often they are much less frightening than they appear. So many of us, because of sin, are looking at ourselves through a cracked lens. We see a damaged distortion of what we are. And we maybe see ourselves through the perspective of the sin that we have committed or the sin that has been committed against us. And that's not a true image, because you need to hear clearly the message from the Father, because this is truly the whole point of this parable. Jesus was telling this parable kind of against the scribes and the Pharisees, the people who believed themselves to be really nice, good citizens, upright, upstanding people, people who did everything right, people who had the system wired. They could get it to do anything they wanted. They were in control. They were experiencing what maybe in our culture would be called privilege today. They were completely happy with themselves. And here comes this Jesus guy saying that God welcomes sinners. Saying that God is maybe looking askance at people who consider themselves righteous, like the elder brother in the parable. What is it that you see when you look in the mirror and examine yourself? That's really what the season of Lent is about, self-examination, sorting out who we are, sorting out what it means to be a human being, to be a parent, a grandparent, to be a student, to be someone in this world. Be careful what you see, and try to look through God's eyes at yourself. someone who is welcomed back, no matter where you've been, no matter what you've done, someone who is able to experience the healing grace and presence of God because of God's love for you. Not because of anything that you've done or not done, but because God has chosen to love you. But we have to take a realistic look at who we are. The son, the prodigal son in the parable, the one who wandered off, found himself looking around and seeing that even the pigs that he was supposed to be taking care of were eating better than he was. He took a full, hard look at himself and where he was and where his style of living, where his decisions and choices had taken him, and the Bible says he came to himself. You ever had a moment like that where you suddenly realize, what in the world am I doing here? How did I get to this point? I've got to change. I've got to do something different. God is always ready to welcome us back. God is always ready to, with his healing, forgiving love, welcome us back to the family. Make sure that you see yourself lost, even if you are not too lost, even if you put on a good show. Make sure you see yourself realistically and trust that God will forgive you. This is why Jesus came. This is why Jesus died on the cross. This is what Easter is all about. It is a celebration of life over death, of love over fear, of forgiveness over the power of sin. It is for you. You are welcome. And God's grace and God's forgiveness surpasses anything that you have done, anything that you are. When you look in the mirror, it's okay to be like the kitty seeing the lion, I think. I love that image. Because you are a child of God. You are loved by God. You are the apple of God's eye. You are cared for more than you can imagine. You are a child of the King. You are not lost. The Father is always waiting to welcome you back.